The plane was nearly full as the father and his daughter took their seats near the back. The hum of the engines filled the air, and the smell of recycled air mixed with the faint scent of coffee from the galley. The girl's hands trembled slightly as she fidgeted with her seatbelt. Her eyes darted nervously from side to side. She wasn't used to the cramped spaces, the loud noises, the sudden movements. Her father smiled softly at her and placed a hand gently on hers. He whispered reassuring words to calm her down, but the tension in his chest didn't fade, not yet. He had been through this many times before. The nervous glances from strangers, the discomfort of not fitting in. The girl was beautiful, with soft brown eyes that reflected both innocence and an unspoken fear. The world was a confusing place for her. The bright lights of the cabin, the unfamiliar sounds, the constant hum of voices, everything felt overwhelming. She clutched her teddy bear tightly, as if it was the only thing that could hold the world together for her. As the plane began to move slowly toward the runway, the father watched the attendants move up and down the aisles, one by one, checking the overhead compartments, adjusting seat belts, making small talk with passengers, as if it was a normal day for them. The girl's father had been on many flights before, but each one felt like a new challenge. He knew the routine, but every time his daughter's discomfort became more apparent, it left him feeling exposed, like they didn't quite belong here, like the eyes of strangers were always on them. The flight attendant approaching them was a young woman with a bright smile. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, and her makeup flawless. She seemed to glide effortlessly between passengers. She glanced at the father, and then at his daughter, who was now hugging her teddy bear to her chest. Her gaze flickered back to the father, and then to the girl again. He noticed her eyes narrow slightly, but he told himself it was nothing to worry about, not yet. As she reached them, the attendant gave a quick nod to the father, and then looked down at his daughter for a brief moment. Her smile didn't waver, but there was something off about it, something that made the father's heart skip a beat. She leaned down a little closer to the girl and spoke to her in a voice that was far too bright, too cheerful, too loud. "Is everything all right here, sweetie? Are you nervous about flying?" she asked. But there was something about her tone. It wasn't sympathetic, it wasn't kind, it was almost mocking. The father felt his stomach tighten as he listened. He knew that tone all too well. The girl didn't answer. Her eyes just stared straight ahead. Her grip on the teddy bear tightened. She didn't respond to the attendant. She didn't need to. The father felt her anxiety spike. He could see it in the way her shoulders tensed, and her fingers curled into the soft fabric of her stuffed bear. But then something unexpected happened. The attendant's voice dropped lower, almost to a whisper, but loud enough for the father to hear. "It's all right, you're not the only one who's afraid. I guess some kids just don't know how to behave on planes, huh?" The words hung in the air for a moment as the father's blood ran cold. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was there just enough for him to hear it. The attendant didn't think he could hear it, didn't think he was paying attention. But he was, and now the anger was starting to build. The injustice of it, the cruelty, the casual way she dismissed his daughter's anxiety as something to be laughed at, something to be mocked. His hands gripped the armrest so tight, he felt his knuckles turn white. He stared at the attendant, who had already turned to walk away, not noticing the fire that was igniting in him, not yet understanding what she had just done. The flight attendant moved down the aisle, her heels kicking sharply on the hard floor, her eyes still flickering back to the father and daughter every few steps. But now there was a coldness in her gaze. She didn't expect him to notice her words the way he did. She didn't expect to be caught not like this. Her smile faltered for just a second as she looked back over her shoulder at the pair, and then quickly turned forward again, trying to pretend it didn't matter. But to the father it mattered more than anything. He sat there gripping the armrest, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced down at his daughter, who still hadn't moved. She hadn't said a word to him since the interaction. All she did was squeeze her bear tighter, like it was the only thing that could protect her from the world. She was so quiet now, almost too quiet, like she was retreating into herself, The father felt a knot tighten in his stomach. His mind raced with the thought of how easily she could be misunderstood, how easily people could think she was just another child misbehaving, another spoiled brat, when the truth was so much more complex. The attendants continued their rounds, but his eyes never left the young woman who had spoken to them earlier. Her words echoed in his mind, as if she had punched him in the gut. They had no right to laugh at her, no right to mock her, just because she couldn't express her discomfort the way others could. His thoughts were a storm, swirling with anger, frustration, and a deep sense of helplessness. The tears were threatening to rise in his eyes, but he wouldn't let them. He wouldn't let this woman see how much her words had hurt him, and worse, how much they had hurt his daughter. He glanced back at the front of the plane. The rest of the passengers were oblivious to what had just happened. The chatter continued. The noise of the engines hummed through the cabin. Everything seemed normal, but it didn't feel normal to him. It felt wrong, felt like something was broken in the system. The girl's father kept his eyes locked on the flight attendant's movements. She seemed unaware of the storm brewing behind her, a storm that was growing inside the father with each passing moment. He could feel his patience thinning like a thread that was about to snap. Finally, the plane reached cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign turned off. The attendants began walking again, offering drinks, snacks, the usual routine. But the father couldn't shake the anger. It lingered. It boiled just beneath the surface, ready to explode. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He could feel his pulse thudding in his temples, his breath coming faster. As the minutes ticked by, he couldn't let it go, not this time. And then it happened. She passed by again, but this time the attendant didn't even glance in his direction. She just moved on with that same confident stride, her gaze never once landing on him or his daughter. He had been patient long enough. He stood up suddenly, his body moving on its own. His mind was already made up. His heart was racing, but his feet were steady. He didn't care who saw. He didn't care if everyone on the plane was watching. He wasn't going to sit back anymore, not while his daughter was being treated like this. He walked down the aisle toward the attendant, his eyes locked onto her back. She was busy chatting with another passenger, her voice light and friendly, but he could already hear the words from earlier ringing in his ears, louder now than ever before. And as he approached her, he didn't know if he would yell or speak softly, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let this go. The aisle felt longer than it should have as the father walked toward the flight attendant, his footsteps heavy with determination, but also with uncertainty. Every step was a battle against his racing thoughts, his breath shallow. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew he couldn't let this moment slip. But he had to do something, anything, to make sure his daughter wouldn't feel like this again. He couldn't stand the thought of her going through this cruelty in silence. As he got closer, the attendant still hadn't noticed him. She was too busy leaning over a row of seats, helping another passenger with a seat belt. He watched her for a moment, wondering if she even had any idea of what she had done to them, of the hurt she had caused so casually, so easily. As if it was nothing, it made his chest tighten with a kind of anger that felt hot and cold all at once. He stopped a few feet behind her, still invisible to her, still just another passenger. In her eyes he could see the back of her head, her blonde hair neatly tied into a ponytail. She seemed so confident, so unaffected by everything she had said. The father felt a flicker of doubt in his mind. Would it make a difference? Would confronting her even matter? Would she just apologize and walk away and forget about this moment like so many others? Would he just be making a fool of himself in front of the whole plane? But then he thought about his daughter, the way she was sitting so still, now her eyes locked on her her small body barely moving, the way she had withdrawn into herself after hearing the words that no child should ever hear. He couldn't let that be her reality. He couldn't let her grow up thinking this world would never understand her. His resolve hardened. He couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't, not anymore. He tapped the attendant gently on the shoulder. Her head snapped around, startled to see him standing there so close. He could see the slight shift in her expression. She was taken off guard, but her smile didn't fade completely. She blinked a few times before offering him a polite, "Can I help you, sir?" Her voice, still too bright, almost rehearsed. The father could feel his stomach twist with the need to speak, but his words came out cold and measured. "You made a joke about my daughter," he said, each word cutting through the air like a knife. For a moment, she froze. Her eyes widened just slightly as the smile faltered. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected someone to call her out in the middle of the plane, not with all these eyes on them. The father could see the discomfort flash across her face, but he didn't let up. "She has autism," he said, now his voice gaining strength. "And your words were hurtful. Your mocking was cruel." The words left his mouth with a weight he hadn't expected them to carry. It was as if he had been holding them in for years, and now they had found a way to escape. The attendant opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Her face flushed a deep shade of red, and she looked down quickly, as if trying to hide the shame that was now rising within her. But the father wasn't done yet. He wasn't going to let her apologize and move on like it was nothing. "You don't get to treat people like that," he continued, his voice steady now. "Not my daughter, not anyone." The silence in the cabin grew louder with every word he spoke. The other passengers had begun to notice the exchange. They shifted in their seats, their eyes darting from the father to the attendant. Some of them had heard what was said. Others were still oblivious to the real cause of the tension. But it didn't matter to the father. He wasn't doing this for anyone but his daughter. He wasn't doing this for applause or sympathy. He was doing this because it was the right thing to do. The attendant finally swallowed hard and opened her mouth again. But this time there was no bright smile, no rehearsed tone, just a soft, almost shaky, "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible as the weight of the situation seemed to dawn on her. But the father wasn't sure that her apology was enough. Not yet. The plane seemed to hold its breath. The low hum of the engines felt distant now, as if the world had narrowed down to just the father and the attendant standing in the middle of the aisle. His eyes were locked on hers, his heart racing, but steady. He had spoken his truth. Now he was waiting for her to respond. The air between them thick with an uncomfortable silence. The other passengers were watching now. Some of them were leaning forward, straining to hear. Others looked away, but the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in the cabin. The flight attendant stood frozen in place, her eyes flickering back and forth between the father and the ground. She opened her mouth again as if to speak, but no words came out, just a shaky breath. And then another silence settled between them. It felt like a lifetime before she finally looked up at him. Her face, pale, her confident posture had disappeared, replaced by something else, something softer but more uncertain. She seemed to shrink under his gaze. "I didn't mean to," she said, her voice weak and barely audible. The father could see the struggle in her eyes. She was trying to explain herself, trying to find a way to make it right. But the damage had been done. The words she had spoken earlier were out in the open, and no amount of apologizing could take them back. The father didn't move. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there watching her face for a moment before he glanced over at his daughter, who was still sitting in her seat, clutching her teddy bear tighter, now her small body barely moving, her eyes wide and frightened. The father's heart broke at the sight. He felt a wave of guilt wash over him for not acting sooner, for not protecting her from this cruel moment. He had promised himself he would never let anyone treat his daughter like this, but now here they were. The flight attendant stepped back slightly, her hands trembling as she reached out for something to steady herself. Her gaze dropped to the floor as she tried to compose herself. But the father couldn't let it go. Not now, not after everything he had witnessed, not after seeing the hurt in his daughter's eyes. "Do you have any idea how much it hurts to be treated like that?" he said, his voice trembling now with a mix of anger and sadness. "To have someone laugh at you when you're just trying to survive in a world that doesn't understand." He looked at the attendant as if trying to get her to understand the gravity of what she had done. But he could see it in her eyes. She was starting to get it now. The apology was no longer a formality, it was real. But it wasn't enough yet, not for him, not for his daughter. She stepped back further, as if giving him space, but her apology was still coming, her voice more stable this time. "I'm so sorry for what I said. I didn't understand. And I will never make that mistake again." The words felt heavier now, as if they were soaked in the weight of realization. The father could tell she meant it, but there was still a part of him that wasn't sure if it was enough, if a simple apology could undo the damage that had been done. The cabin was still silent now, every eye on them, as the attendant stood there wringing her hands, unsure of what to do next. The father could feel his anger starting to dissipate, but the hurt still lingered in his chest. He looked at his daughter once more, before turning back to the attendant, his expression softening, but only slightly. "I don't expect you to fix everything," he said, his voice quieter now, "but I do expect respect for my daughter, and for everyone else who struggles with things you don't understand." He didn't wait for a response. He simply turned away from her and walked back toward his seat, his hand reaching for the armrest. But his mind was still racing. He wasn't sure if anything would truly change. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had done the right thing. The father sat back down in his seat, his hands still trembling slightly as he fastened his seatbelt. He glanced at his daughter, who hadn't moved, still clutching her teddy bear, her face hidden behind the soft fabric. The silence between them felt heavy, like a fog that wouldn't lift. The words the attendant had said still echoed in his mind. But there was something different now, a small shift, a sense of victory that had yet to settle in fully. He wasn't sure if the moment had truly made a difference, if the apology had been enough, or if his daughter would ever feel safe from the world's harshness. But for now it was the best he could do. He reached over and gently rubbed her back. She didn't react, but he knew she felt the comfort in his touch. The flight continued on the noise of the engines, and the occasional chatter from other passengers became background noise. But the father couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him. He knew that the confrontation had made an impression, but he wasn't sure what kind of impression it had left. Had the passengers seen him as the hero, the protector standing up for his daughter, or was he just another man who lost his temper and made a scene? He couldn't control what others thought, but the weight of the moment still pressed on his chest. A few minutes later, the attendant came back down the aisle. This time, she moved more cautiously, her eyes flicking over the father and his daughter. She paused when she reached them, her posture uncertain, as if unsure what to do next. The father didn't look at her at first. He kept his gaze on his daughter, who was still silent, still in her own world. But then he felt the attendant's presence linger just beside him, and he knew she was waiting for him to acknowledge her. When he did finally look up at her, she didn't speak at first. She just stood there, her hands folded tightly in front of her, her face now devoid of the bright smile she had worn earlier. Now it was soft and sincere, a far cry from the confident woman who had made the cruel comment just moments before. The father could see the guilt written all over her face. It wasn't the forced apology anymore. It was real, and it was raw. "I just wanted to say again how sorry I am," she said, her voice quieter now. "I didn't understand before, but I do now, and I'll never treat anyone like that again." She paused, as if searching for the right words to say, but there was nothing else to add, nothing that could take back what had happened. The father looked at her for a long moment, his thoughts swirling around in his head, but then he sighed and nodded slowly. He didn't need a long drawn-out apology. He just needed to see the change in her, the recognition that what she had done was wrong and that it wouldn't happen again. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice softer than before. "I hope you do learn from this, and I hope my daughter never has to face something like this again." He didn't say it out of anger, but out of a deep hope that maybe this moment could change something, that maybe his daughter's future wouldn't be full of these kinds of encounters where she was made to feel less than just because she was different. The attendant nodded again, and then slowly walked away. The father watched her go, but his focus quickly shifted back to his daughter, who was now looking up at him, her eyes wide and searching. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes said everything he needed to hear. She was okay. She was going to be okay. He had done his part, and now it was up to her to find her own strength. The rest of the flight was uneventful. The tension in the cabin slowly dissipated as the minutes passed. The father leaned back in his seat and let out a long breath. He had stood up for his daughter in the face of cruelty, and for the first time in a long while he felt a sense of peace settle over him. As the plane cruised steadily through the sky, the father couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within him, something deep that he hadn't fully understood until now. He had fought for his daughter, and in doing so he had fought for something bigger than just that moment, something bigger than the words of a flight attendant who had once been so unaware. He thought about how many times in his life he had stayed silent when he should have spoken up, how many times he had let things slide when deep down he knew they were wrong. But today was different. Today he had found his voice. He had found a strength he didn't even know he had. His daughter was still sitting quietly beside him, her teddy bear still clutched tightly to her chest. But now she was looking out the window, her face softening as the world below grew smaller and smaller, the sky stretching out before them. As the plane flew on, she seemed peaceful, at least for now, and that was enough for the father. He knew there would be more battles ahead, more moments when the world would feel too big and too overwhelming for his daughter. But today he had made a difference. Today she had been seen. Today she had been defended. The flight attendant didn't come back down the aisle again after their brief exchange, but the father didn't expect her to. The moment had passed, and now they were all just passengers in a sea of strangers, each of them lost in their own thoughts. But the father kept thinking about the conversation he had with the attendant, how her tone had changed, how her confidence had faded when she realized what she had done. He wondered how many people had been hurt by careless words like hers, how many others had suffered in silence because no one had stepped in and said enough. The father felt a strange sense of pride mixed with a quiet sadness for what his daughter had to face in the world every day, for how often she had been misunderstood and mistreated because of something she couldn't control. But there was also hope, a small but powerful glimmer of hope, that maybe, just maybe, things could change if people like him kept speaking out, kept fighting for the ones who couldn't always fight for themselves. He glanced over at his daughter again. Her eyes were still fixed on the window, her lips slightly parted as she breathed in the cool air from the vent above her. She was calm now, and that was all he could ask, for he reached over and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. She didn't acknowledge it, but he could tell she was aware of him, they're aware of his presence, and that in itself was enough for him to know she felt safe. The father leaned back in his seat, his thoughts drifting, but there was one thing he knew for certain. He would never let moments like this pass again. He wouldn't stay silent when someone was wronged. He wouldn't let his daughter or anyone else be made to feel small or less than just because they didn't fit into the mold of what the world expected them to be. He had been quiet too long, and now he knew better. The plane continued its journey, and the father closed his eyes for just a moment, letting the quiet hum of the engines soothe him. The tension that had built up throughout the flight was slowly unwinding, but in the back of his mind he couldn't help but wonder how many more moments like this one there would be, how many more people would have to face cruelty before they found the courage to stand up and speak out. But for today, at least, he had done his part, and that was enough. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. The father tried to relax, but his mind kept racing. He kept replaying the scene over and over in his head. The words, the confrontation, the apology. It was all so surreal, like something out of a dream. But it had happened. It had been real. And now, as the plane began its descent back toward the ground, the father felt a sense of quiet satisfaction deep in his chest. He had stood up for his daughter. He had made sure someone heard her voice, even when it seemed like no one else cared. The anger that had surged in him earlier now felt distant. It had been replaced with something else, a calm, that came from knowing he had done the right thing. But as the plane began to lower its altitude, the father couldn't shake a new feeling, a feeling that lingered just beneath the surface, something he hadn't expected to feel. He thought about how the attendant had apologized, but there was still a small part of him that wondered if it had really been enough, if she had truly understood the weight of what she had done, if the apology was just something she said to get past the moment, or if she had truly learned from it, if she would go out of her way to make sure it didn't happen again. He glanced at his daughter again. She was still looking out the window, her eyes lost in the vast expanse of the sky below her small face, peaceful and serene. She had always been a quiet soul, but there was something about her today that felt different, something about the way she was holding herself that made the father feel a flicker of hope, that she wasn't as alone in this world as he had once feared. Maybe this world wasn't as cruel as he had made it out to be. The flight attendant finally came down the aisle again. This time her movements were slower, more deliberate, and when she reached the father's row, she paused for a moment, just long enough for him to notice she looked down at the daughter, who was still staring out the window, her teddy bear resting on her lap. Then she looked back at the father, her eyes softer now, not the cold, distant look from earlier, but something warmer, something more genuine. The father couldn't help but notice the difference in her demeanor. She was no longer the flight attendant from earlier. She had changed in some way. "I just wanted to say," the attendant began hesitantly, her voice quieter this time. "Thank you for what you did back there, for standing up for your daughter. It wasn't easy, but you did the right thing." Her eyes flickered briefly to the daughter, and then back to the father, as if searching for his reaction. The father's heart skipped a beat for a second. He felt a pang of uncertainty. Was this just another apology, or was there something more behind it? He looked at her for a long moment, his mind still processing everything that had happened today, before finally responding in a calm, steady voice. "Thank you for understanding," he said, his tone measured but sincere. "It means more than you know." He wasn't sure if she truly understood the full depth of his words, but he said them anyway, because it was the truth. The attendant nodded, her eyes lingering for a moment before she moved on down the aisle, but the father couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside her. He couldn't know for sure, but he hoped that this moment would stay with her, that it would be a lesson she would carry with her every time she interacted with someone who was different, someone who needed understanding instead of mockery. The father looked back at his daughter once more, and he smiled softly, knowing that this was just one small victory in the long road ahead. But for today, it was enough today. His daughter had been seen today, she had been heard, and that was all he could ever ask for. As the plane began its final approach, the father couldn't help but feel a wave of relief wash over him. It was almost over. The tension that had built throughout the flight was finally starting to dissipate, the bright lights of the city below now visible through the windows. But even as the plane descended, he still found his thoughts drifting back to his daughter, her quiet face, her wide eyes, the way she had handled everything with a calm that belied her age. He had always known she was strong, but today he had seen it in a new light. His heart swelled with a sense of pride. He didn't often let himself feel he had spent so many years protecting her from the world, shielding her from the cruelties he knew were out there. But today was different. He hadn't just shielded her, he had stood with her, he had given her a voice when it had been taken from her. And in doing so he had shown her that she didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone, that there were people who would always be there to fight alongside her, no matter how small or large the battle. The plane touched down smoothly, and the cabin buzzed with the usual sounds of disembarking passengers, gathering their belongings, and chatting in low voices. The father reached over and gently squeezed his daughter's hand. She looked up at him for a brief moment, her expression still calm, but now with a soft hint of recognition in her eyes, like she knew something had changed, like she knew that she wasn't alone in this world anymore. As the passengers filed out of the plane, the father noticed the attendant one last time. She was standing near the exit this time. Her face was still soft, but there was a new determination in her eyes. It was as if the experience had left a mark that would stay with her longer than any apology could ever do. The father couldn't help but wonder if the encounter had made her think twice about how she treated others. Maybe, just maybe, she would carry that lesson with her in her future interactions with passengers. Or maybe it would just be another memory fading into the background of her life. But for the father, he hoped it would be different. He hoped that today would make a lasting impact on both of them. As he and his daughter walked down the jet bridge, the father looked down at her again, her hand, still in her teddy bear, still clutched tightly against her chest. But there was something different in the way she held it now, almost as if it wasn't just a comfort to her, but a symbol of the strength she carried inside of her, even when the world didn't understand her. They walked out into the airport terminal, and the father paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. He had done what he set out to do. He had defended his daughter. He had stood up when it mattered most. And now all he wanted was to take her home where she would be safe, where she could be herself, without fear of judgment or cruelty. He knew that there would be more challenges ahead, but for now he felt a sense of peace, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the world was a little bit kinder today than it had been yesterday. He looked down at his daughter one more time and smiled. "You did great today, kiddo," he said, his voice soft, but filled with love. She looked up at him and smiled back, a small but powerful smile that said everything he needed to hear. Together they walked into the crowd, their footsteps in sync as the world continued to move around them. But for that moment, it felt like everything had stopped, like it was just the two of them standing tall against whatever the world might throw their way.